There is a well-known saying that goes, always give the hardest job to the laziest person because they will find the easiest way to do it. What is the best real-life example to this you have seen? Story 1 was a temp got hired for the day to print 30 packets with 100 pages each. Why would it take a day? I asked. Our printer doesn't collate the pages, so it will take you the day to sort the pages into the 30 packets, they said. Right, IT was a standard office Xerox printer. It took me all of 30 seconds to find and click the collate button. Clicked the staple button while at it. All got printed by itself into nice stapled packets, and I got paid to browse the internet for the day. They thought I was a genius for fixing their printer and gave me glowing recommendations to the temp agency that led to more jobs. Story 2T my last job, a truck suspension shop. We did inventory every December, and it was someone's job to count all the washers and screws of every size. It was my first inventory, and I casually mentioned that they should just weigh one screw or washer, then weigh them all and divide the weight to get the count. Everyone looked at me like I had given them the key to the universe. Counting washers and screws went from a day or two to just a few hours. Story 3. Worked in a huge hotel by the airport. We had layovers with over 400 people. I think we were 3 employees. They had a buffet for dinner and then left to go to bed since it was 1 a.m. Rule was, we should always go to the room and pick up as many plates as we could and then bring them to the cleaner. Took for ages and I wanted to go home. I decided to roll out the cart and collect the plates and put them on the cart. Guests were seeing it and started putting their plates on the cart when they left. All of a sudden, hundreds of people cleaned up their own stuff. Duty manager saw it, and I thought he would blast me. Since the hotel was a 5-star place, he just looked at me, smiled, and said, "That's why I like to hire lazy people. They think of ways to finish work faster." Story 4. I worked at a chain restaurant, and in my last few months there we got those stupid table kiosks that customers could pay at. There was a survey at the end of every transaction, and our managers added new performance metrics based on how many people paid using the kiosk and also how well our service was based on the surveys. One would just fill the surveys out himself after his customers left and gave himself 5 stars in everything. Dude was always ranked top of the servers. Genius. Story 5. I have an example of how the truly lazy will sabotage tracking so no one knows it is broken. There was this guy at a software company that does integrated software systems. He hated his boss and his job and apparently most of his team. Every time he was assigned a bug to fix, he would mark it resolved and assign it to a no-reply email address associated with the team. The odd thing that I don't understand is how he managed to keep issues from getting escalated to other real people. At any rate, no one caught on. When he found a new job and a couple people on his team took him out for drinks, he said, "You should look into all the bugs I've fixed." I never did any of that, so the guys who took him out for drinks went back and audited his work and were like, "Holy f***." He not only did nothing, he hid identified issues for like a year. Story 6. There's a story that I've heard a few dozen times about a toothpaste company that had accidentally sent out cases of their product that had a few empty single boxes of toothpaste. The company had endeavored not only to rectify their mistake, but to ensure they did not repeat it. They hired an engineering company that designed a scale and alarm shutdown system. If an empty carton was passed down the production line, klaxons would be triggered and a full stop would initiate until the offending box was recovered and an all clear had been entered into the computer system. Before production could resume, the company paid through the nose but was ultimately pleased with their failsafe, and the engineers patted each other on the back. A few months passed and the engineers returned for quality control. The toothpaste company reported 0 margin of error for weeks. Turns out, one of the minimum wage hairnet types on the assembly line didn't appreciate the sound of klaxons or working with computers. So, he or she had aimed a large fan at the production line before the scale that blew the lighter, empty cartons off of the conveyor belt. Problem solved. Story 7. Worked as a cashier during the holiday season back when I was 16. The supermarket was selling drinks by the boxes, and at that time, we only had barcode scanners that were at the front of the computer. No gun-type scanners existed. I was lazy and didn't want to carry boxes up to the scanner, so I politely asked my customers if I could carve out the barcode from their box to scan and keep. Some agreed, some didn't want to, but eventually I managed to amass all the barcodes needed, labeled them, and kept them in a file for easy reference. Apparently, some other cashier got green-eyed at my smart move and complained to the chief cashier, who promptly lectured me on bullshit alert how it's dangerous for me to scan such barcodes as I might scan the wrong things. She told me to throw it all away and carry the boxes like I was meant to. I mean, I was young, so I could, but the other cashiers were older, and some were elderly and needed the customers themselves to help carry the boxes to the scanner. But whatever, I guess jealousy trumps common sense. Story 8. I used to process SHA claims around 10 years ago. One system we had to use back then was an old as hell terminal program that took 4 line items per page. That's it. For a usual claim, no big deal, not too hard to keep track of things over 2 or 3 pages. For a longer claim, most fit on one. However, we had the dreaded showbox claims. This was the person who saved up every receipt all year in a metaphorical showbox and sent everything in once a year to empty their account. We hated them. Dozens or hundreds of line items totaling thousands of dollars. Just because you only have $500 in your SHA doesn't mean we get to stop there. If you sent in $4,000 in receipts, I gotta account for it all. Totally killed your numbers for the day, and they tracked claims per hour religiously. The main issue was double-checking that everything added up right when you were done entering it. At 4 items a page, it took forever to tally. So, I made an Excel sheet. It was laid out so I could enter every single line, then run a macro that would calculate the needed totals and dump all the text to a text file formatted exactly so I could select 4 items at a time and paste them directly into the terminal window from the default starting cursor position, and every field would fill in automatically. Copy, paste, next, copy, paste, next, copy, paste, next, etc. It easily halved my entry times, with way less work. Finding any typos was much easier. I just had to look at one column organized sheet instead of scrolling through God knows how many pages of terminal text. It was great. I showed it to my manager so the rest of my team could use it. She was horrified I would use something like that, as no human was double-checking as they went along. This despite demonstrable improvements to my error rates on large claims after I started using it. She ordered me to stop using it and forbid anyone in her team from automating any part of their job at all. I kept using it for all of the 2 months I stayed there after that. I had some of the highest claim per hour numbers and lowest error rates on her team. I never developed any more tools for them. Story 9. In high school, we had to do 4 book reports every year. A friend of mine did his Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit freshman year and turned in the same 4 book reports for the rest of his time in high school. You switched English teachers every year, so no one ever caught on. I was never brave enough to try the same thing. Story 10. I worked a summer at a mortgage company as an assistant to the underwriters. My only job was printing documents and then hole punching them to put in folders. They had a super fancy Xerox printer that basically did my entire job for me. But the underwriters at this company didn't know how to click through printer settings to make the machine hole punch as it was being printed. I showed them how to do it, and they resisted it super hard like they didn't trust it. I don't know, so I got to keep my job. But what was supposed to take me all day literally took me about 20-30 minutes first thing in the morning. So they started assigning me real tasks and even offered to keep me on to eventually become an underwriter too. Because I was so sharp, I knew how to use the very expensive printer they already had. I was just about to start grad school, so I had to politely decline. But I'm pretty sure they didn't hire someone to replace me when I left. Story 11. I used to deliver beer. I did not like delivering beer. I may have ended up with 30 stops in a day, including deliveries that the customer would call into our office for. I used to bring extra beer and blank invoices with me on the truck to prevent having to drive back to my warehouse to deliver 1 keg to a place that I was currently across the street from. 7 years later, the driver of that route is still doing that. Story 12. When I worked at an inpatient unit, one of the tasks we'd get would be to do a check-in with every patient. There were about 100 when we were full. Nobody wanted that task. It would usually get split up, except this one guy who was pretty lazy always wanted it, and I didn't understand it because he was lazy. Finally, one day I was walking out for a break and I figured out what he did. He plopped himself right beside the food line door and wouldn't let people go in until they did their check-in with him. That's not how it was supposed to be done. It was supposed to be a chance for clients to connect with staff. But he'd get it done in an hour or so for the whole unit and be done for the day. It was in a mental health facility. Kind of figured my username would give that away. This wasn't to assess suicidality. That was a separate task in which people were given as much privacy as possible during morning meds. You sign something when you enter a group treatment center that says you understand that it's group treatment and confidentiality is limited. Story 13. I once was a temp at a tiny office on a construction site in around 2003. I was only there for one day while the regular person was on some training. They sat me down and told me that I just needed to copy all these numbers from one program to another. So I selected them, hit Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V. They stared at me. Turns out about 60% of this woman's time had been spent manually typing numbers from one place to another. Story 14. I was working at a kids' chess summer camp with this guy who just horked down pots like you wouldn't believe, still a far better chess player than me. One day, the kids were being particularly rambunctious and I told him he had to take them outside to get their energy out. He had them spend the next hour doing American Ninja Warrior on the jungle gym or playground. I hadn't even heard of the show, but it was a group of young boys like 6-12, so they all adored it. This coworker loved to get super stoned and watch it. Don't know if he was high at the camp, but he just got to sit on a bench and tell kids their time was getting slower when they did stunts and they just scurried and jumped around faster. Story 15. A few years ago, my mom was tasked with fixing my grandparents' toilet while we were visiting for the holidays. The toilet reservoir was constantly filling and running, and thus flooding the bathroom, because the buoy arm wasn't lifting high enough from the water in the reservoir to switch off the water flow. My mom, who is normally a very practical person, had been tackling the issue for hours. She was pretty distraught, thinking we would have to order a new buoy arm, maybe even a new sensor, or switch and pull the whole assembly apart to replace everything. She was planning out a trip to Lowe's and pricing things out when I walked in. I took one look at it and bent the metal arm the buoy was attached to down, so the arm had a slight upwards curve. The buoy still reached the same level in the reservoir, but registered on the sensor as higher because of the curve in the arm. Problem solved. Rangers lead the way. I watched it dawn on her what I had done, and she just looked at me like I had a third eye and said, "You little I've been getting my kicked by this thing for 4 hours and you fixin' in for fucking seconds?" She was very happy I saved her from more work and spending more money. She calls me her little toilet engineer from time to time. I work on aircraft. It's mildly demeaning. Story 16. I worked in a CNC shop. There would be a pile of jobs that needed to be done for the month. Some took days to run while others were generally quick. The record for jobs done in one day was 8. What I did was look through all the jobs and organize them by setup, meaning every job has a setup time. Can take an hour to get all the tooling together, setting up the cutting table, and setting the part square to the table so the machine can gauge where the part is, so when I insert the code into the machine it can run flawlessly and drill, mill, tap whatever within a literally hair measurement. For every single job, majority of parts use standard tooling, and I have an automatic tool changing with 20 pockets. Long story short, I figured out how to line up the jobs so they all have the same setup. Blew the record out of the water with 30 jobs done in one day, saving the company tens of thousands in work hours, all because I didn't feel like doing all the setups that day. Story 17. I am in that quote and I don't like it. When I was at university, I had an ID help desk job for one of the colleges. My team was tasked with taking inventory on every computer in every room of like 5 buildings. Computer aim, some college ID code, the Dell serial number, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it took ages to gather all the information in just one room. About a week into the process, I decided that I'd had enough of manual writing everything down. On my work machine, I just started running all of the get cmd commands I could find, and eventually had a batch file on a flash drive that would just save a computer's information as a text file on the flash drive. So I'd walk into a room, log into each computer, run my file, then log off. I went from doing a couple of rooms a day to doing a couple of floors a day. I still had to input everything into the system, but that felt great. Story 18. Got hired into a plant that just got a big new job building stuff for the military. My job was materials associate, which basically meant I drove a forklift and staged parts that were built. The engineers came up with a floor plan for all of the parts and where they needed to be staged. They used fancy lasers and measuring devices and built it all in CAD. After telling them it wouldn't work, they said, "Well, let's see you do a better job." I organized the entire 50,000 SKU or EFT warehouse so that each part was close to the machines that use them. It followed the first in first out method, and each department knew where their parts went when they were done making them, put up signs and whatnot. After that, my job was basically pointless because the warehouse ran itself. I decided to teach myself how to use the welding robots in my downtime. Fast forward 3 years, and now I'm an automation engineer at one of the largest parts suppliers in the industry. P.S. Robots are very easy to learn and operate if you're struggling to find what you want to do in your career. Places are hiring with minimal experience too, cause there is a huge lack of people in the automation field. Get a 1-year college certification in mechatronics and you can make around 40–60K starting depending on location. Story 19. My dad and I were working on my grandma's water heater a couple of years ago. We needed a cork or something to go over the end of the pipe. I had a bottle of Coke in my hand. I downed the Coke and put the cap on the end of the pipe as a joke, but it fit perfectly, so we kept it there. When my grandma sold the house 5 years later, that cap was still on the end of the pipe. I wasn't necessarily the laziest person, but I was the DLH designated light holder and I was providing emotional support through smartest comments, so I was definitely taking the job the least seriously. Story 20. Back when I was a cashier at Borders, we had to keep a certain percentage of Borders rewards transactions. I was good at my job and was able to get in the high 80s, low 90 seconds every month by being a good salesman and convincing them to get it. There was another guy I worked with that had an insanely high percentage, and I didn't understand how he did it. We later came to find out that he would just swipe a card and put it into people's bags without saying anything about it. He got caught and was given a warning and put on probation instead of being fired for cheating. Fast forward about a month and I find out he's getting promoted to work on the floor with all the movies and music. I could not believe they promoted him after all that shit and looked me over, someone that was actually a hard worker that did a really good job and often would have people compliment me to my managers. Then again, the management there was I eventually got fired from there because the guy covering for me while I was on vacation got fired and they somehow expected me to know and come in. Story 21. I had an Excel order form in my last job that required us to enter all hardware items from all suppliers in by hand. I had to completely rewrite the existing script that pulled the hardware for the one supplier that it worked on, but it went from being a time-consuming, mistake-prone job to clicking a button on the order form and it doing everything and taking maybe 2 seconds for a huge job. Figuring out dynamic named ranges and getting them to work with drop-down boxes was also great. No more manually updating named ranges and drop-down boxes when new items were added. I also added in conditional formatting everywhere to let the user know if there was an incomplete section on the form. No more rework when the next person down the line sent the form back to us incomplete. The thing I was really happy with was being able to cut the length of that script down by about 65% from what it originally was.